So please, a warm welcome for Dr. Geoffrey Yo.
Thank you, Eric, and good afternoon, everyone. My paper is entitled Speech Act Theory and Concepts of the Record. In choosing this topic, I was aware that I would be speaking to an audience, some of whom know a lot about concepts of the record in archival science, and others for whom this is largely unknown territory. I'm also aware that some of you may already be familiar with Speech Act theory, while others probably know very little about it. So let me begin by saying a little about records and then a little about Speech Act theory. I won't have time to give a very full account of either, so if I summarize and simplify some rather complex ideas, I hope those of you who are already experts on these subjects will forgive me. So, records. Here are some typical definitions from the professional literature. I've chosen one from the UK, one from Australia, and one from Canada. And different though these definitions are, one thing we can immediately spot is that they all connect records to activities, or to what the Canadian definition calls the conduct of affairs. There is general agreement among archivists that records are linked in some way with things that people or organizations do, things that happen or take place in the world. I'm sure Terry Eastwood wouldn't mind if I borrowed a phrase of his and say that by general consensus, records are inextricably connected with activity. Now, the third definition also introduces a further requirement that records are preserved. This requirement may also seem uncontentious, but in fact, it opens up a debate about whether the term record should be restricted to items whose long-term value has been assessed, or to items actually set aside for preservation, or whether records are records independently of any judgments about their management. On this issue, the world of archives is divided, but I don't intend to enter into that debate today. What interests me today is the earlier part of the equation, the link between records and activities. We all agree that the connection is close, but there is little agreement on its precise nature. Archival literature variously characterizes records as evidence of activities or events, or as information or documents created in the course of these phenomena. However, none of these characterizations is universally accepted, and I have long felt there is scope for further investigation. Are records merely produced in the course of activities, or do they have some deeper connection to the activities concerned? What about records that are produced after the activity is complete? And if records serve as evidence of activities, what is it about records that allows them to do so? These are big questions, and my thoughts on these subjects are very much work in progress. The line of thinking I have found most helpful is to see the connection between records and activities as representational. Broadly speaking, representations are things that stand for something else. And as some of you will know, I have written at some length about the suggestion that records can be characterized as representations of occurrence, that is, of activities processes, transactions, events, and other temporal phenomena. And more specifically, as representations created by participants in or observers of the phenomena concerned. And I have argued that a representational view of records is more inclusive than traditional definitions which tend to emphasize particular formats or align records to particular cultural or organizational contexts. This view recognizes that records can have memorial, aesthetic, and symbolic as well as evidential and informational roles. But it suggests that we need not define specific reasons for creating, keeping, or using records in order to understand their character. Well, in my talk today, I want to explore some ways in which the theory of speech acts may be able to help with what I call my work in progress. Speech act theory was developed in the last century by the philosophers J.L. Austin and John Searle. And it works from the assumption, and here I'm quoting from Searle, that the minimal unit of human communication is not a sentence or other expression, but rather the performance of certain kinds of acts, such as making a statement, asking a question, or giving an order. In speaking or in writing, we can perform one or more of these acts. The seminal work on speech act theory is Austin's How to Do Things with Words, published in 1962. Austin noted that performing acts through what he termed utterances is characteristic of conveyancing instruments and other legal documents. Lawyers, Austin says, when talking about legal instruments, will distinguish between the preamble, which recites the circumstances in which a transaction is effected, and the operative part, which actually performs the legal act. So in a will, the clause, "I give and bequeath my watch to my brother," would be an operative clause. That's the end of the quotation from Austin. Now, the notion of operative clauses in legal instruments is familiar to archivists who have a concept of dispositive records, that is, records which serve both to effect an action and to provide evidence of it. However, Austin rejected the word operative, and in its place he proposed the term performative utterance to indicate spoken or written utterances whose issuance performs an action. His examples of such utterances included, "I pronounce you guilty," "I bet you sixpence," "I apologise," and "I name this ship the Queen Elizabeth." To make these utterances under the right conditions is to perform the act concerned. Austin originally set out to distinguish performatives from what he called constative utterances, that is, statements of facts or alleged facts that are presumed to be either true or false. He challenged the assumption that the purpose of language is to convey information. When a royal personage makes the utterance, "I name this ship," she does not merely tell her audience what the ship is called. By uttering these words, she performs the act of giving it its name. But Austin's work led him to the discovery that making a statement is also performing an act. If we follow his arguments, we find that the utterance, "grass is green," is merely a more convenient, though less explicit, form of the utterance, I state that grass is green, and that stating is just as much an action as bequeathing a watch or naming a ship. Constatives turn out to be performatives as well. After Austin's death, Searle popularised the label speech acts by which the theory is now commonly known. Both Austin and Searle acknowledged that actions can be performed through written utterances, but their main focus was on spoken acts, an emphasis made explicit in the label that Searle adopted. Searle also propounded a taxonomy of 5 categories of speech act. Here they are. We have the assertive, in which a speaker or a writer sets out a proposition. The directive, in which she attempts to get the hearer or reader to do something. The committive, in which she commits herself to doing something. The expressive, in which she expresses feelings or attitudes. And the declarative, in which she brings about changes in the world through her utterance, as with utterances that declare war, dismiss an employee, adjourn a meeting, or marry a spouse. Like all taxonomies, these categories are certainly not beyond dispute, but many writers on speech acts have found them useful. Now, the speech acts of Austin and Searle do not seem so very far removed from the activities and transactions that archivists talk about. But speech act theory is not widely known in the world of archives. Apart from my own work, I know of only 2 archival scholars, Pekka Hentunen and William Underwood, who have addressed speech act theory in any depth. Arguably, Austin and Searle's emphasis on speech has obscured the relevance of their work to archival science as a discipline primarily concerned with written documents. But during the last 40 years, Austin and Searle's ideas have been examined and adapted by many scholars in other fields, including many who are concerned with writing and written text. For example, speech act theory has influenced computer scientists modelling organisational interaction and human communication techniques. Specialists in this area have coined the name language action perspective to describe their theoretical framework in a way that acknowledges their concern with computer-mediated rather than spoken actions. In another discipline, the textual critic Peter Schillingsberg, when seeking to adapt speech act theory to the analysis of literary texts, invented the term script acts to label his approach. Other scholars have proposed communication acts as a more inclusive term. However, none of these alternatives has won wide acceptance. Speech acts remains the generally used term, even when the acts in question are performed by means of writing on paper or digital media. So, how might speech act theory help to illuminate our understanding of records? Well, I only have time today for a brief exploration of possible points of contact, but my starting point is again the notion of representation. Representation is a key component of speech act theory, which, as Searle notes, affirms that we can perform an act, I quote, by saying that we are performing it, that is, by representing ourselves as performing it. So representation does not merely stand for an occurrence, but helps to constitute it. Searle also seeks to distinguish representation from communication. He argues that in a speech act, and I quote, "What is represented is a state of affairs, but what is communicated is not a state of affairs, but one might say the representation of that state of affairs." Representations, according to Searle, determine the force and content of speech acts, but such acts also require communication. Representations by themselves do not perform acts, but are an essential part of them. In Searle's view, there is, and I quote, "no communication without representation." Speech act theory also tries to explain why some utterances alter states of affairs while others do not. To quote Searle again, "Why is it that I can't fix the roof by saying I fix the roof, but I can promise to come and see you just by saying I promise to come and see you?" Broadly speaking, the answer is that the physical ordering of the world renders it impossible to fix roofs by means of speech or writing alone. But in other cases, humans can make agreements that communicating particular kinds of representation can bring about particular results. These agreements commonly operate as social conventions at the level of a human community. The community in the United Kingdom accepts that utterance in a certain context of the sentence, "I, the returning officer, declare John Smith duly elected," achieves Smith's appointment as a Member of Parliament. And communities worldwide agree that spoken or written utterances of "I promise" bind the speaker or the writer with an obligation to do something. Some of these conventions are enshrined in law, and the law may prescribe particular forms of words to ensure that outcomes are beyond dispute. The words used by returning officers provide an oral example of this phenomenon, but it is perhaps commoner with written utterances. The prototype, I would suggest, is the legal document, such as a mortgage or a conveyance, whose validity may be challenged if the appropriate wording has not been used. In diplomatics, the label dispositive is restricted to records which use legally or juridically accepted forms of words to effect transactions or other activities. In such cases, the legal system recognizes that the action is achieved by communicating a suitably worded written representation of the action itself. But many other records work in a similar way. Business letters, for example, may not be recognized as dispositive by diplomatists because their written form is not juridically required. But Speech Act theory nonetheless suggests that transmission of such letters achieves acts of making agreements, commitments, orders, requests, acts that Searle categorizes as commissive and directive speech acts. A letter can also be used to effect a declarative speech act, for example, when it appoints someone to chair a meeting or fill a vacant post. In each case, societal conventions allow us to effect the act by creating a written representation of the act and sending it to the relevant recipient. When an act is performed by means of a written utterance, the representation normally persists after the initial communicative component terminates, and hence we have a record of the act in question. Speech act theory also indicates that we perform speech acts even when we send letters or memos or other documents whose role appears to be purely informational. Suppose, for example, that an aide sends Napoleon a memo such as this. Examining this memo from a speech act perspective returns us to Austin's discussion of constatives and performatives. Like grass is green, Moscow is 2,000 kilometers from Paris, appears to be a constative utterance, a statement of a fact. However, as we have seen, Austin argued that all such utterances are the performance of an act, the act of stating, informing, or asserting. In Searle's taxonomy, Napoleon's aide performed an assertive speech act. The act was effected through representation and communication, and because its representation is persistent, Napoleon will have a record of the assertion that was made to him. A speech act perspective can also be brought to documents like this, which dates from the 11th century. This document is perhaps also a record. But what exactly is it a record of? Traditionally, it would be seen as a record of Edward's grant to Ealdred. Diplomatics applies the label probative to documents like this, documents whose purpose is to provide evidence of actions that were already complete before the document was written. From this point of view, such documents do not have a dispositive or performative role. They are purely evidentiary. But speech act theory sees things rather differently. From a speech act perspective, we can identify a performative speech act in the second sentence of this document, but it is an act of informing, not an act of granting. And the clause "I have granted" is simply the proposition of which Leofric and the Thanes were informed. I would argue that the view of records as representations acts as a bridge between the different perceptions of diplomatics and speech act theory. In representational terms, two tiers of action are represented in this sentence. The action described in the proposition, that is the grant to Ealdred, and the action of informing Leofric and his colleagues that the grant has taken place. The document contains representations of both these actions. It also contains a representation of the act of greeting the king's subjects. Diplomatic scholarship treats the opening words, King Edward greets Bishop Leofric, as a mere formulaic preamble or protocol. But greeting one's subjects is itself a speech act. This document served to perform two speech acts, greeting and informing, and contains representations of three actions in total: greeting, informing, and granting. At a later period, kings discovered that records of grants of minsters and the like need not be limited to the probative mode, and that grants can be made by means of dispositive documents. Or in Searle's terminology, they discovered that grants can be performed by written speech acts. But that is a story for another day. In both my examples, the creator of the document has made an assertion, but my second example differs from the first because the creator here did not assert a supposedly timeless fact, such as the distance from Paris to Moscow. Instead, he asserted the occurrence of a previous time-bound action that was not effected by transmitting the document itself. Nevertheless, from a Speech Act perspective, Austin's conclusions apply to the second example as much as to the first. For Speech Act theorists, the documents that diplomatists call probative are not mere constatives, they are performatives too. Now, in both of these examples, the creator has used the assertive phrase, "I inform you," to represent his performative action. But, as Austin noted, when making statements, we generally feel it unnecessary to include assertive phrases of this kind. We do not generally need to include the words, "I inform you," when we are making a statement to someone. And we can look at two further examples. The first one is a letter, or perhaps a memo, and the second one is a report. Neither of these contains an explicit assertive, but the builder's signature, or his name on the letterhead, nevertheless indicates that he is asserting the proposition that he has fixed the roof. Viewed from the perspective of speech acts and representations, his report has a similar structure to the probative document issued by King Edward in the 11th century. One speech act encompasses representations of two tiers of action. The action that Bob describes and Bob's action in describing it. The former is procedurally separate from the creation of the report. The latter is intrinsic to it. We can treat Bob's report as a record of the fixing of the roof, as a record of Bob's claim that he has fixed it, or as both. Fixing a roof is a physical action that in itself does not lead to the creation of records. But there is a long-standing view that records of such actions can be made by participants or observers who assert in writing that the actions have occurred. A record of any completed action can be created in this way. Diplomatics restricts the label probative to documents whose written form and procedurally separate construction are legally required. But Speech Act theory does not privilege legal recognition over other forms of societal or communal acceptance. Bob's report may not meet formal legal criteria, but the wider community may still accept his report, and others like it, as records of the actions they describe. Now, we should note that in every case that we've looked at, the creator of the document is claiming that they are reporting a fact or facts. Facts about the way the world is, or facts about what has happened in the world. However, the possibility that the creator may have misrepresented or misunderstood what they report can never be dismissed. The creator is performing the act of asserting a proposition, but propositions are always open to dispute. There are always possibilities of error, ambiguity, or deliberate misrepresentation. Perhaps grass is not always green. Perhaps the distance from Paris to Moscow depends on the route you take. Perhaps Bob is lying when he says he has fixed the roof. or perhaps he is genuinely unaware that the rainwater is still seeping in. Even propositions in documents that diplomatists call probative, although buttressed by legal forms and juridical contexts, may be susceptible to challenge. Has the king really acted in the way he claims to have done? Barry Brown's study of timesheet records in an oil company showed how employees compiling timesheets represented their work in ways that would demonstrate conformity with organisational expectations, and how compliance with formal accounting requirements was valued above attempts at faithful representation of the tasks the employees undertook or the hours that they actually worked. And many other recent papers in archival literature and elsewhere have sought to indicate that records may not be as trustworthy as they appear. It has been widely argued that record-keeping practices are often directed at minimising any trace of deviation from official procedures, or at showing record creators in the best possible light. Such studies align with the growing number of works by postmodernist authors seeking to emphasise that records can lay no claim to neutrality or impartiality. Studies of this kind typically look at health records, police reports, juvenile court files, records which rely on propositions asserted by record creators after the completion of the actions they describe. Performative utterances, however, cannot be impugned so easily. Indeed, Speech Act theory goes so far as to suggest that they have what Searle calls a self-guaranteeing character. According to Searle, if I say, "I promise," my speech act may be insincere or misguided, but I can't be lying or mistaken about it having the force of a promise, because merely making the utterance gives it such a force. Of course, there's nothing in the natural order of the world that ensures the self-guaranteeing character of a promise. It is merely a convention of human society that people who say, "I promise," are in fact promising. But Western societies depend on acceptance of conventions about promises and the like, and this affects our view of commissive records such as promissory notes. Such records are not constructed after the event. They are intrinsic parts of the actions they represent, and unless we have grounds for claiming that they have been forged or tampered with, we cannot easily argue that no promise has been made. We can draw similar conclusions about records that Searle's taxonomy would label as assertive. Consider the memo informing Napoleon of the supposed distance between Paris and Moscow. As we have seen, this proposition could be ambiguous, mistaken, or fallacious. But there can be little doubt that the record creator was asserting it for better or for worse. The memo stands as a record of his assertion, even if the proposition he asserted is open to dispute. Likewise, we may not be convinced that the record created by Bob the Builder offers incontrovertible proof that Bob has in fact fixed the roof. But unless we think it is a forgery, we will be less inclined to question its status as a record of his assertion that he has fixed it, or to problematize its representation of the statement that Bob has made. Okay. Archivists in the audience will certainly note some of the limitations of speech act theory where records are concerned. For example, it has more obvious applicability to written and humanly created records than to visual records or to reports automatically generated by computers. But even if it cannot provide a comprehensive account, speech act theory can make important contributions to our understanding. I'd like to suggest that it may offer us a middle way between the extremes of objectivist and interpretivist views of the record. It is subversive of the widely promoted objectivist view that records are a category of information and that a rigorous records management program may be able to ensure that their contents are full and accurate. Looking at records through the lens of speech act theory reminds us that they are not so much factual information assets as representations of actions performed. Any informational qualities they have are dependent on those actions and their representations. Some record creators seek to inform their audiences by asserting propositions which, in an objectivist worldview, can be characterized as true or false, as accurate or inaccurate, but not all records are assertive, and in any case, acts of asserting, like acts of promising, ordering, or declaring, cannot themselves be assessed in terms of truth or falsehood. At the other extreme, speech act theory also offers a challenge to postmodernist views that records are merely texts with little connection to any originary events. In this school of thought, emphasis shifts from the genesis of records at fixed moments in the past to their fluctuating interpretation by readers in the present. The role of the record creator is minimized or denied. There are said to be no stable meanings or contexts, and records are seen primarily as occasions for subjective experience. Speech act theory is hospitable to some of the ideas propounded by postmodernism. In particular, it reminds us that propositions in records may express individual perceptions rather than empirically verifiable facts. But it also tells us that records are inextricably linked to assertive, directive, commissive, or declarative acts performed at particular moments of time. And in this regard, it introduces a necessary separation from postmodernist ideas that nothing can exist beyond the text, that there is no originary moment or action, but only the interpretive processes we experience today. Speech act theory invites us to recognize a contextualized, original first writing that effected an action in the world, an action which subsequent readings of the record do not effect. The fashionable emphasis on readers' engagement with texts and the belief that meaning can only arise from such engagement have naturally led some commentators to suggest that events have little or no existence independently of narratives that purport to tell about them. In archival literature, postmodernist writers frequently voice the idea that events are shaped or constructed by the archives in which they are recorded. The record is perceived as giving rise to reality rather than vice versa. And events are assumed to occur not in history, but in the response of the individual reader. Speech Act theory also affirms that records construct reality, but in a very different sense. From a Speech Act perspective, the reality that records construct is social rather than individual. Bequests, promises, instructions, and the like come into existence because members of a community acknowledge that such things can be made by written utterances in mutually agreed contexts. So records are primarily instruments of action, not mere descriptions or stimulants of it. Some records, those constituted by propositions of assertive speech acts, are post hoc representations, but when records of acts of assertion, direction, commission, declaration are created to enable the performance of those acts through writing, the representation itself participates in the action or event, and record and event emerge simultaneously. Now, there's much more that could be said. In particular, I'm interested in Searle's work on what he calls institutional facts and deontic phenomena, that is, the rights and responsibilities that commissive and declarative speech acts can create. I'm interested to explore how these ideas might relate to our understanding of the records that sustain such rights and responsibilities. Searle offers the example of selling, bequeathing, or mortgaging property, in which, and I quote from Searle, the devices used are speech acts, deeds, bills of sale, registration papers, wills, etc. For example, Searle goes on, a bill of sale for a car is a speech act, but it now counts as your title to the car. End quote. So the construction and communication of the bill of sale counts as a speech act, and the written speech act in turn counts as a title deed. But this is a big topic, and its detailed exploration must await another occasion. Another topic I have not been able to examine is the application of speech act theory to library and information science. I know that David Blair wrote about this in his work on information retrieval in 1990, and some of you have mentioned to me other more recent work in which speech act theory has been used. What strikes me is that some of the arguments about propositions in records and their dependence on assertive speech acts could be applied equally to propositions in published information sources, and that there is almost certainly scope for further investigation of speech act theory from an information science viewpoint. For the moment, however, I would like to leave you with the thought that speech act theory brings us to the heart of the debate about the nature and role of records. It reminds us that they are not mere sources of information, nor are they simply texts that serve as a trigger for subjective experience. Speech act theory can help us understand how records participate in and operate as representations of a range of activities that take place in the world. Records testify to the power of the performative. They are implicated in the actions and events that underpin much of human society. Thank you very much.
I inform you that we are now at the question and answer portion of our presentation.
This man was listening to the presentation.
I do try. So, what I can do is I can move the microphone around, and you can ask your questions directly to Geoffrey.
Jeff, thank you for a very interesting paper, well considered. I think that what you've presented today actually does illuminate the record and shed new light on it. I would also say that if you're interested in Searle's ideas on institutional and deontic powers, I would refer you to a paper I've just published in the Journal of Information Science on Searle's social ontology and concepts of the record, which also draws on your concepts of records, and marries it with Bunge's ontology. So your observation about Searle and his idea that records constitute and are involved in a social reality versus a physical reality are spot on. That was one of his major contributions. Bunge is all about the physical world. My question is, something to consider. Do you feel that, or do you think that Searle and Austin, whose works I'm less familiar with, have a rather ungraded view of representation, in that it's either on or it's off? And with them, obviously, it's on. Records represent. But there's no gradation in their ideas of representation. And if you agree with that, do you think that's problematic?
Yes, I think I do agree with it, and I think it is potentially problematic. There is a very large literature about representation, as well as a large literature about speech acts, and I have written about some of that literature elsewhere. And there are many authors, both in the field of philosophy and in the field of psychology, and no doubt in other fields too, who have perhaps adopted a more nuanced view of representation than Searle does. In Searle's work, as far as I can observe, he takes it as something of a given. I wouldn't want to suggest that I'm necessarily taking it as something as a given, but when I'm quoting from Searle, I'm obviously at some level adopting his understanding. As far as I can recall, Austin doesn't talk about representation, and that is something that is brought to speech act theory in Searle's later developments, particularly, I think, his work in the 1980s. And I do agree that underlying a lot of what I have been talking about and a lot of what I think you're writing about in your paper, which I have indeed seen, are questions about our understanding of what we might mean by representation, how a representation might operate, whether we might or might not, all of us, perceive representations as operating in the same way. I'm fairly certain that we would not. Issues about how we understand one thing to be a representation of another, and my suspicion, I don't have any ready-made answers to those questions, but my suspicion is that a large part of the answer needs to be sought once again in the area of societal and communal understanding. Searle talks about context quite a lot. He has a phrase which he uses regularly in his work, which I didn't quote in my paper this morning. I did talk about things counting as something else. Searle's little maxim, which he uses when he's talking about counting as, is the phrase X counts as Y in context C. And I would like to perhaps tentatively suggest that we should look at representation in terms of those contexts, and particularly in terms of societal contexts, because my strong suspicion is that it is our shared understanding of how representations operate that allow us to use them effectively in our lives and in our day-to-day business. I hope that answers at least some of your question, Vicky.
I'll be moving around here.
I'd like to follow up on that. When you talk about representation, or when the people you talk about representation, usually there needs to be some sort of mapping, some way of interpreting the representation. And if the representation is linguistic, of course there's the whole issue of do we understand the language in which it's, so if I don't speak English or read English, then one might argue whether or not it's a record, at least to me, which gets a little bit like the trees in the forest. If you look at something like a fossil, one might argue that that's a record. I mean, certainly that's what a paleontologist says. But it only really becomes a record when we paleontologists understand how to interpret it. And I think you see in everyday life a very good example of that, and you referred to issues of law. So in contract law, it seems, and this is a generalization, but generally it's usually not in dispute what the contract says. Sometimes it is. But because and certainly the intention is somewhat agreed upon in that you entered into a contract to do this and such, and it may, in fact, end up interpretation, but usually it's whether or not you follow the contract. Whereas at the other extreme, you look at criminal law, the records that are brought into a criminal court are usually not intentional in the sense that the criminal rarely intended to leave a record of what the criminal has done. And the issues that are brought out in the court, the jury or judge has to decide upon, are the interpretation and the veracity of or the probabilities of the interpretation. And I guess the final example might be going back to something like paleontology or lots of things that are in criminal forensics. As we develop new technology, such as learning how to use X-rays, developing MRI machines, etc., things that used to have a very low content and the mappings or translations of the representations come into existence after the fact of the creation of the record, which brings into question whether intentionality is even part of it. So I'm wondering if you could comment on the role of the mappings that seem to be constituent parts of what it means to be a representation.
I think I agree with almost all the remarks that you have made there. I'm not entirely sure what it is you're looking for in the area of mappings. The notion of mapping always worries me because at some level making a mapping from one thing and another can be an attempt to tie down the meaning at a level that perhaps we're not necessarily wanting to do. And I might, again, to revert perhaps to my answer to Vicky's question just now, I might want to see this more in terms of mappings perhaps within a particular community that allow us to map our understanding of one thing and the way in which we might perceive it to represent another. And I think at the start of your question you raised the issue of language, which is an obvious case in point. There are issues not only about our understanding of a record that may be written in English or in French, and our failure to understand and appreciate records that are written in a language that we are not familiar with. So there's a question of the way in which concepts in the world are mapped to languages. But I think there are underlying that, one can take it to an even deeper level and start looking at questions about why it is we feel that language can represent anything at all. We're getting into waters where braver souls than I have feared to tread. I think all I would like to say at this stage is, yes, I am very much aware of the kind of issues that you're raising. I agree with the points you made. There are many, many issues about the way in which records operate or are perceived to operate that we don't fully understand, that I don't claim to fully understand. I see the work that I've been doing on Speech Act theory as moving me a little closer to some level of understanding, but I would be the first to admit that I still have a long way to go.
So maybe just a short follow-up. A particular instance of this that comes up in computer science is end-user license agreements. And there's actually a lot of research going on now about how to turn those into documents that are both legal documents, which they already are, but also understandable documents. And I think this comes back to the remarks you made about contracts, etc. To a lawyer, those are written in plain language. To someone who speaks the language of English, they are often not in plain language, which I think is the essence of the question I was asking about which mapping would we use for a record? Is it the lawyer's mapping, or is it the everyday mapping of the people who may have signed it?
And it may need to be both, indeed, in some way or other. But the contract is an interesting case because it again brings into play questions about different levels of certainty. My sense would be, and you may take a different view on this, but my sense would be that most legal disputes about contracts are not about whether the document in question is or is not a contract. The dispute is about the terms of the contract and the interpretation of exactly what it was that the parties to the contract did or did not agree to do.
All right, some great questions. We've got room for one more.
Was interesting to hear where you think that Speech Act theory can take an intermediate position, or some intermediate positions between what you called interpretive and objective, I believe. And also you mentioned the role of community and context, and I think what Searle would call the deep background in all this. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if Speech Act theory's ability to exist and move back and forth along that continuum is related, in your mind, in any way to the size and complexity of that community, whether it's physical or virtual. So let me give you an example. Our excitable neighbors to the south have a constitution, and it may have worked very well for 13 small colonies of mostly white men, but how does it work for 50 states in the 20th or 21st century in terms of applying Speech Act theory to interpretation arguments over the Constitution, whether it is the originary document like the Bible that has to be taken as fundamental truth, or whether it can be interpreted and can evolve past adding the amendment regarding guns.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the question was there.
The question is there any kind of community that's ideally suited to using Speech Act theory to interpret records? Is it the Greek city-state, or does that matter?
I'm afraid I've no idea.
All right, if we could give a warm round of applause for Geoffrey and thank him for his